Everyone says transform or die.
Consultants come in, conduct an audit, and then ask, why are you doing it this way? And the owners go, actually, why do we manage things this way? Well, that's just how we've always done it.
It's how things evolved. The signs of a revolutionary situation. Those at the top can no longer operate as before, while those at the bottom no longer want to.
Who should initiate the business transformation process?
Whoever makes that decision, it has to be sold to the entire company.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today we're joined by Oleg Zabchinok, Armen Kurginian, and Oleksandr Sadko. Today we will be discussing the topic of transformation. Previously, we discussed digital transformation with Armen Kurginian and Dmytro Kozlov. Today we'll be looking at the broader topic of business transformation. Colleagues, these days we hear a lot about transformation, digital transformation, and all kinds of transformations. At times it feels like it's become a buzzword that means something different to everyone. What exactly are we talking about?
We really are dealing with a situation where everyone understands this concept differently. Just yesterday, while scrolling through Facebook, I came across the phrase that goes like this: transformation instead of strategy. For me, personally, it struck a particular chord because within my own paradigm, I have always believed that transformation serves the purpose of building and shaping a company in a way that enables it to achieve its strategy, providing it with the capabilities, resources, and organizational capacity required to execute and deliver on its strategic objectives and the goals it has set for itself. But here I was seeing a new interpretation of the concept taking shape. Indeed, in Ukrainian business practice today, we are fighting not only a war against the aggressor, but also dealing with internal processes, internal stakeholders, our customers as buyers, our employees, and all those people who are connected to and involved with our companies. And in my view, on the one hand, this is probably a new trend behind which everyone hides their own interpretations and meanings, while on the other hand, it may even be, at least in part, a matter of survival for companies. Because Ukrainian businesses are constantly facing challenges, and especially now, the scale of the pressures and shocks that can hit a business are growing and accelerating at an extremely rapid pace. First of all, there is the military aggression, various economic risks, and potential tax and legislative changes. We are facing serious demographic challenges that have affected both our economy and the current state of affairs. This is also driven by the fact that part of the population has left the country, while purchasing power continues to decline. On top of that, there are global economic challenges and various trends and developments taking place across Europe and the world as a whole. And in addition to this, so to say, we are seeing rapid digital development, further accelerated by the dynamic advancement of artificial intelligence. All of these factors are converging one another, and again, the understanding of owners and management, including both state and private companies. Each of them interprets and processes these developments differently. Some want to implement a digital transformation agenda, making greater use of AI-powered digital agents and replacing certain functions currently performed by employees. Others are trying to take a more conservative approach while still making changes that can provide a boost for future growth. Because again, everyone understands and everyone is trying to see what the development of Ukraine's economy will look like after the war. And absolutely nobody is abandoning the belief that this development will happen and that it will be exceptionally dynamic and fast-moving, especially when you take into account the vast array of complex processes that truly need to come together in a single unified direction.
Business has always been changing. There are organic changes, and if the word transformation had not become so fashionable, we probably would not be calling it transformation at all. We'd be talking about business change or even a change in the business model. It is a change in the business model. You can call it transformation or you can call it a change in the business model. What is the difference between organic change and transformation?
I would use the word improvement here because for a long time companies have been moving through improvement. There are several processes at play. We have an understanding of what needs to be done, and that is fine. But today there is a great deal that needs to be changed. And when we start moving a little higher than business processes toward the operating model and the business model, and there we accumulate a certain number of things that need to be changed simultaneously, where they influence one another, that is where transformation begins. So I would see it as a more comprehensive change, and I really agree with what Oleksandr is saying. In the world, it is great when we use artificial intelligence, changes from the digital environment, infrastructure development, when we see some positive changes, when we see something something in another country, some similar models, and start planning to build something similar in our own country. But right now, that is not such a large percentage of cases.
In most cases, we need to do something simply to keep moving forward, to continue doing this efficiently, to solve the question of how to do more with fewer people. That is why I would start by saying that transformation is already a matter of scale.
In other words, when we reach that scale, and scale itself brings with it teams, experience, partners, and so on.
Therefore, transformation is more complex, but probably also more, as they say, sexy, which is why the term transformation is used more often than simply improvement.
I would add two dimensions. The first is the depth of change.
Improvement is something more superficial, whereas transformation touches deeper processes within the company, perhaps even the company's core business processes. If it is a trading company, then these are, of course, processes related to sales, service, and so on. If it is a manufacturing company, then these are processes related to production.
So the first dimension is depth, and the second is necessity.
I have this feeling that transformation is something that the external environment forces us to undertake.
So without it, the company will not be able to continue operating?
But that is the first point. And the second is that it is driven specifically by external factors. In other words, there are things that we want to change from within. We can see that the old way no longer works, and in other words, those changes have matured from within. They are driven by internal contradictions of one kind or another, and we change them, but there are other changes which I am inclined to call transformation that the external environment compels and forces us to make.
I'd like to add one point here. Globally, this is more about what they call disruption, startups, and technology. They no longer allow things to be done the way they were done in the past, but we are facing a perfect storm. The macroeconomic situation, the war, and all these challenges, along with the technology-related challenges that also exist globally. That is why I say that from what I see, most transformations are driven by necessity.
Perhaps we should even look at transformation as something that consists of several stages. In other words, it is not just a matter of improving operational processes. To stand still, you have to move twice as fast, and that is exactly what is happening to us right now. In addition to having a market that is constantly shrinking, including because of shelling and the ongoing uncertainty around opportunities, including opportunities for investment, on the other hand, as I said before, we face certain constraints related to the human factor, while at the same time companies and economies are confronted with the need to redesign processes in such a way that they do not have to be changed again at every step, but instead create an opportunity and deliver improvements that allow them to operate without this constant cycle of change. Because constant change is not particularly good either, as companies often do not have time to adapt before new changes are required. What is needed is a level of change that creates sufficient capacity and potential for that change to then be fully realized.
So that it can continue operating in that form for some time?
Well, to build a strategy, right?
In your view, who should initiate the business transformation process? The owner, the board, the chief transformation officer, the CEO?
I would even add something to that question, if I may. Who should be the first to recognize that transformation is overdue? In other words, who should not only launch or initiate it, but also recognize that the time has come and that the company can no longer continue operating otherwise? My answer would be that it is not so important who that person is. It could be anyone. I really like the approach some companies take. For example, who should report a customer complaint? The first person who sees it. And that does not mean it has to be the technical director, the CEO, or a manager. The first person who sees it should report it. Who should start or initiate the transformation process if it is required by the external environment?
The first person who notices that it's immature.
There are indeed very advanced owners who are able to recognize it themselves. People who see what is happening in other countries, new technologies, who have the time and inspiration to act on it. Sometimes it can be the internal management team that notices something, although they are not always able to start that journey on their own. Unless they can sell the idea to the owner, it is unlikely to happen. Sometimes it is also consultants who come in from the outside, conduct audits, and then ask, why are you doing it this way? And the owners respond, actually, why do we manage things this way? Well, that's just what we're used to around here.
It's how things evolved.
Yes, that's how it evolved historically, is by far the most common answer to almost any question.
So this is effectively part of risk management?
Yes, the need to discuss or initiate transformation naturally emerges from an analysis of the risks facing the company, 100%.
but perhaps it should be viewed through the lens of a combination of risk management and, for example, the work of a strategic committee or the interaction between the board and the company. Because indeed, I agree with Oleg, operational management, being constantly immersed in day-to-day operations, is not always able to see the bigger picture. He frequently encounters significant obstacles and complex challenges that prevent him from achieving the results that were originally outlined and specified within the budgets or strategic goals. And that is exactly the reason why these specific circumstances can cause or lead to the absolute necessity of implementing comprehensive organizational transformations. On the other hand, they are probably not particularly interested in it because well-designed processes, or at least established processes, let's put it that way, allow them to manage the business. Because anything unknown always creates certain constraints and, among other things, delays in the flow of information. Once you disrupt established information flows and processes, you immediately find yourself facing uncertainty. This is probably a vision that is more characteristic of owners, because entering new markets, once again, is a very significant question. Or launching new projects adjacent to the core business, complementary initiatives, or supporting ventures that may bring something new. And the changes associated with these initiatives can also influence the decision to initiate a transformation process. But in my view, this is a role that is more naturally fulfilled through the cooperation of the strategic committee and the board. Based on your previous discussions, one of the board's roles is precisely to provide expertise and a broader perspective in order to move the company or business forward.
And probably an external perspective as well, because top management operates from within the system, constantly engaged in the race to achieve KPIs, OKRs, or other targets and objectives. And that constant pursuit does not give them the opportunity to take a broader view of what is currently happening at the strategic level. Whereas the board and the owners are, in fact, always looking at things from a strategic perspective, and it is, at the very least, easier for them to do so. Can you give any examples of situations where an owner or a board member decides that a transformation is needed? When they have reached the point where they realize that's it, that it is no longer possible to continue without it?
Well, yes, we have. There is an example, Sergiy, from our time together on the board where the market situation evolved in such a way that the company had to transform and change its approach to customers, moving from working through intermediaries to working directly with customers. And this is actually a great example of a transformation driven specifically by changes in the external environment. Competition develops in a certain way, and partners start behaving more aggressively, forcing the company to move away from the traditional and comfortable arrangements that had previously generated solid profits. And it is forced, and I would say genuinely forced, to undertake a major investment project in order to gain direct access to the customer. And that is transformation, 100%, perhaps even a strategic transformation, I would say, because continuing to operate the way it did before is no longer an option, and the company could lose roughly 2/3 of its earnings if it fails.
Followed by a continued gradual decline.
Yes, exactly, a gradual decline.
I'd give another example. There are two companies that stand out as true benchmarks in our market. They are MHP and Nova Pošta. Nova Pošta is talking about this a lot right now. You can't always see in the news what MHP is doing, but if you look at how they are building their digital infrastructure, how many businesses they have, and how they are restructuring their business model to capture value across retail, wholesale, and production alike, it becomes very clear. For me, MHP is probably the best example, and probably the same applies to the transformations that began when Monobank appeared and other banks started moving as well. For example, Private Bank was already strong in terms of digital experience, but the other banks had to completely rebuild themselves. Now, the way they are planning, for example, the number of branches, the war is also affecting this, as well as the number of employees. These are good examples of how a combination of factors improves the service for us as users. So for me, these are probably the most vivid examples that can be clearly seen.
But these are all examples where the external environment forces change, where competition, roughly speaking, pushes companies toward transformation.
Nova Pošta is interesting in this regard. There has been some criticism in that direction, but I find it very interesting and want to see how this transformation ends. Because it looks like Nova Pošta was not really suffering from some major internal problems that it had accumulated. On the contrary, they expanded into other European countries, but the ratio of people actually working in offices, administration, bureaucracy, support functions, and branches, they are probably an example of a company that started creating this movement from internal factors.
Do you mean the layoffs that happened recently?
I don't see it only as layoffs. I think it is more about correcting the mistakes that had been accumulating over the years, and about finding additional resources to keep moving forward. Because the Ukrainian market really does not scale that much. It is clear that here you need to build a lean organizational structure, fulfill your tasks, and maintain very high-quality service. They've done everything that was possible. But to have the resources to keep moving forward, those resources have to come from somewhere. If they simply keep spending on internal inefficiency, then it is basically just burning money.
A number of significant organizational transformations are also closely related to the fact that the company currently faces, among many other things, a deep-seated internal crisis within the corporate structure. This situation is also accompanied by substantial and pressing financial difficulties and constraints, which are possibly due to specific strategic decisions that were made incorrectly at the time, or perhaps due to a persistent inability to effectively use its current organizational resources to expand its profitable areas or successfully generate much-needed additional revenue streams. And that is precisely the issue businesses are facing. It is a matter of survival. Obviously, everyone says transform or die. We sometimes find ourselves in exactly that situation, where if you do not change, and sometimes even change dramatically from top to bottom, you simply have no chance of moving forward. That does not mean it will lead to immediate failure, because different types of businesses have their own unique ways, including maintaining certain financial reserves to effectively manage their own stability. But then it becomes a matter of time. And again, taking into account everything that we thoroughly discussed at the very beginning, we now have an incredibly fast-paced and constantly changing environment that just keeps continuously layering complex new challenges and obstacles on top of everything else. And that is precisely the reason why, without these essential changes and without these critical transformations, businesses today have very little chance of being able to survive and move forward.
I would probably add another example that I am currently following. It is Ukronafta. You can also look at what has been happening there over the last few years. This semi-state transformation combined with the influence of the private group. And right now I can see positive changes. We'll see how things develop from here. But it is definitely something worth watching. And then for me, perhaps the most striking example is Netflix. People often talk about it as a startup story, but more broadly, the way they transformed both the industry and the company itself. For anyone looking for a global example and wanting to explore the topic further, I would start with Netflix. There are already many business case studies about it, but it remains a truly fascinating subject.
The Netflix example is very interesting, and I agree with that, but their situation was also shaped by several overlapping factors, including changes to their strategy that were driven by COVID. Had COVID not happened, they probably would not have made some of the changes they made, many of which were driven by necessity. I am absolutely certain that they had the exact same strategic approaches. But the unavoidable and forced transformations that happened, when combined together, resulted in a truly remarkable and significant leap forward for everyone.
In general, COVID can also be studied in terms of how it impacted the industry. For example, I focus on retail, and it has significantly transformed retail as well.
For instance, the owner, the board, and management saw the need for transformation. How was that decision made? It will likely require financing and possibly additional resources or time, for example, involvement of top management in the project. Who makes that decision?
When transformation begins with the idea that this is the only way we can do it, that is already the first mistake. That is why there should be people on the board who would have the opportunity to consider alternatives. Alternatives need to be calculated, and to calculate them, you need to understand why things are currently not working well and why we are forced to move forward. So in practice, you first need to at least assess and describe the current state. Then you build a gap analysis between the current state and the future state and calculate several alternative scenarios, because today we have both technologies and different models, meaning the same problem can be solved in different ways or through a combination of approaches. That is why, from my experience, several combinations are usually developed and then evaluated using a relatively simple financial model, such as NPV, because serious transformations typically have a multi-year payback period. You also need to take into account the time value of money, and then, using NPV combined with risk management, you can begin initial testing. But sometimes after testing, you can see that people return to a different scenario.
It is not so important who, by position, makes the decision about transformation as it is important to see that our strategic goals as they stand today cannot be achieved without transformation. This is the first zero stage, or even stage -1, when we realize, both top management, the board, and owners, that given the strategic objectives we have, the external environment has changed so much that without transformation, we will either never reach them or will reach them much later than planned. And this is the first stage where we see that transformation is not mature yet. And then the formal decision can be made by the board, the owner, the CEO, or all of them together. But what matters is that whoever makes the decision at the top, it has to be, so to say, sold to the entire company, meaning at all levels. Because until every manager understands that this transformation is necessary precisely because we will not be able to achieve our targets and that they themselves will not be able to reach their KPIs, including bonuses and motivation, without changing certain deeply embedded processes, the transformation will not actually happen, even if there is an initial order from the CEO or owner saying that from tomorrow at 9 a.m. we start the transformation. And this decision may be formally made, but the other hundreds of people working in the company need to understand why it is needed. Why can't we continue the way we have been operating for the past 10 years? What is the problem? Well, we've been doing it this way. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was great, and sometimes it was not so good. Let's just try again. As long as these thoughts exist, the transformation is not mature, it is not sold in that specific sense of being sold. Neither sold to middle management nor to the top management. I'd say that even if a formal decision has been made, the transformation cannot begin until everyone understands why it is needed and why we cannot continue doing things the way we did before.
There can be different approaches to how business transformation is conducted. It can be done with the involvement of consultants or even with broader participation from certain board members. But we also know cases where a separate role is appointed and even a position of Chief Transformation Officer is created. Alexander, you are a Chief Transformation Officer. What is the role of this position in the transformation process?
It is complex. I want to say right away that it is quite a challenging role, because I very much agree with what Oleg said at the beginning and what Armen continued about the importance of understanding ASIS. But for different companies and at different stages of their development, this can sometimes be a very difficult process, because ASIS means that you already have stable, fixed, fully described and relatively formalized processes, while in reality many Ukrainian businesses, especially during their growth phase, are primarily focused on rapidly scaling market share, increasing revenue and improving profitability, often under significant time pressure, and therefore they prioritize speed of execution over structural documentation, which means they try to deliver results first and only afterward. As a secondary step, go back and properly describe, formalize and standardize how things actually work in practice, which in turn creates a natural gap between how the business operates and how the business is formally modeled. People are working. Yes, something has changed here. There are new clients or new channels coming in. Yes, who is responsible for this? Yes, you are responsible for this, and often there is not even a proper formalization process for assigning new responsibilities to these people. So this is the first critical point. In order to even start doing something, to visualize it, and even to sell the idea to the board, owners, or management, as Armen said, you need to have a sufficiently clear and detailed understanding of where the business needs to go. And the fundamental responsibility of the transformation officer, or the manager responsible for these transformations, is to establish and oversee this entire framework and to organize the team, because that is also a significant and complex challenge in itself. It is absolutely essential and vital to utilize the current team for any possible parts of the process whenever it is feasible, because this leads to very rapid changes, which the company also needs. But again, it's important to understand that the current managers working in the company are, first of all, already engaged in some established processes. They do not always fully understand or are able to provide a broader perspective of what could be, because they are operating within the system itself. So they sometimes even lack the ability to understand how other market players operate, or even not just other players in the same market, but how things could be done in a fundamentally different way. Because in order to make that next step forward, you first need to understand how things could be done differently. And the current operational manager does not always have the capacity to do that. And this whole idea of organizing a team, describing processes, designing what the future state should look like, and what results it should bring to the company. Because even to evaluate the NPV of such a transformation, everything needs to be properly quantified, modeled, and translated into some fairly large-scale assumptions, and structured financial logic is not a simple task at all. It's not exactly
About assessing the impact.
It is a very complex task, and it also involves communication between the board, the owner, and the management running the company, as well as feedback loops inside the organization in order to provide, among other things, quick wins and other improvements to their way of working. And this is probably exactly where the role of a transformation manager lies.
I know that in your case you report directly to the board.
In our case, let's say it is both a classic and non-classic situation, again, considering that the role of business redesign is more closely tied to strategic objectives of the company, and therefore it should stand slightly above the operational situation in order to have real influence on these processes. That is why my current position is precisely to act as a bridge between management and the board, while reporting directly to the board.
How frequent or common of an occurrence is it for the Chief Transformation Officer to be responsible for reporting directly to the board, working right alongside the Chief Executive Officer?
Again, it is important to remember that this can vary significantly from company to company. Just to take half a step back for a moment, in order to be truly able to influence, drive, change, and sometimes even insist on changing certain specific organizational processes, you really need to be positioned either on the exact same hierarchical level as the CEO, or in some cases, even higher than them. Thus, this positioning is what allows you to effectively prompt the CEO to make certain necessary changes. Because this is not always a comfortable situation for the CEO, since for them it often represents a zone of uncertainty and disruption of an established structure. And it has a certain impact on the established structure, because leadership hasn't been cancelled by anyone. We all understand that this structure, among other things, faces the fact that transformation can sometimes lead to, and sometimes does not lead to, the replacement of management.
This reminds me of the situation with a Chief Innovation Officer. These roles are quite similar because a CEO is usually very focused on delivering results within a given budget year and executing the operational plan, and does not always have the capacity to simultaneously manage transformation, innovation, and ensure that teams consistently deliver on KPIs. That is why this role requires additional authority granted by the board, and a transformation officer or transformation office is important in that sense, because without that mandate, it becomes difficult to drive meaningful change across the organization. Because the CEO in this context may also not always be fully aligned or even comfortable with it, sometimes feeling personally challenged or questioned by why changes are happening at all, while not always fully recognizing that these changes are driven by external factors entering the business environment. They may feel that it's their fault. For some reason we didn't continue working as usual. It's just a bad year. It's the mindset of the war will end soon, something will happen and everything will be as before. I've been working in this field for 10 to 15 years. Why external people come in and audit processes is also always perceived as offensive. Somehow people start looking at how we used to do things, and there is always a lot that can be found and questioned. That is why the conflict here can become very serious, and some form of support or mandate from the board is extremely powerful. Because the CEO will not always be 100% on the side of transformation.
But I have to add that this is not normal. I understand that this happens very often, and we as board members also face this very frequently. But resistance to transformation when it is already mature is, again, this is a very important clarification. I have even noticed that it is a bit like the signs of a revolutionary situation when those at the top can no longer continue as before, and those at the bottom no longer want to continue as before. So, if those at the top can no longer operate in the old way, there can't be a situation where a mature CEO resists this change. If the CEO resists transformation when it is already mature, and external factors clearly show that, well, friends, we need to change, then something has to be done about that CEO, because the board cannot replace that responsibility. Yes, the board can support this stage of transformation, but fundamentally the question remains whether the CEO is reacting appropriately to external risks, especially if they are trying to preserve the status quo and avoid transformation. This does not really align with what I would consider the behavior of a proper CEO.
Okay, I probably just threw in the idea of a proper CEO. It is like a unicorn in a vacuum, as someone once said. I am simply referring to the fact that I have seen smart CEOs, in quotes, who truly supported transformation, said everything will be great, we are fully on board, please proceed. But then they would start quietly sabotaging all subsequent activities and wait for the Chief Transformation Officer to fail the process, so that halfway through they could say, yes, this was all a mistake, now we'll straighten everything out. And then tell the owners, look at me, I saved the business. These strange people spent a few $100,000, worked for a year, and in the end achieved nothing. And then, this is nonsense. Don't touch me any further. I am the only person who can help you navigate this situation and keep everything under control. Unfortunately, if a CEO is competent, they will not say that a transformation is unnecessary when it is truly needed, but they may still enter a mode of passive or even active resistance, unfortunately.
Of course, such situations require a certain level of experience from all participants involved, from board members, from owners, and from the CEO. Exactly, and the Transformation Office must have both support and clear authority delegated from the board and from the owners. Yes, and the board and the CTO need to communicate extensively with the management team, including the CEO, in order to avoid such confrontations and conflict situations that can easily escalate and block progress. And of course, all of this requires a certain level of expertise at board level. In your view, what kind of expertise should exist at the board level in order to successfully initiate and navigate a business transformation?
I'd start by saying that they need to validate how relevant the transformation plans are. Because if resources are poorly planned and the first early achievements and initial months show unsatisfactory results, it becomes extremely difficult later to maintain motivation and support for the initiative. On the contrary, sometimes you need to plan for some quick wins, the fastest victories, so that you can then show that we really can change, that it has an impact, and that it's time to move forward. Because sometimes, for example, an ERP implementation can take several years, and it's very hard to get the team on board. They're sometimes overloaded. There have been cases, Armin is aware of this, where during implementation the accounting team is forced to operate in two systems simultaneously, and this continues not for a month or two, but for more than half a year. So the question becomes, how do you build trust? That's why I'd focus on the plan itself, how relevant it is, and then whether the execution actually works in practice.
The key is not to turn the pursuit of quick wins into the entire transformation process itself, because transformation, by definition, goes beyond the short-term operational horizon of the company and in many cases extends beyond it, meaning that not all changes will deliver immediate results. And sometimes the changes that need to happen in a company will not lead to immediate results, but in order to maintain alignment, understanding of the process at the middle management level, and sometimes even at the ownership level, quick wins still need to be delivered in a structured and intentional way to demonstrate progress and sustain engagement over time. Execution and board-level expertise are really about validating whether those plans are feasible in practice and whether the necessary resources are actually available to deliver them. Because when, during transformation, it turns out that there are not enough resources, it can negatively affect the entire process, since what was initially described as a 100,000 initiative suddenly turns into 1,000,000, and that mismatch in expectations and reality can undermine trust very quickly. And that is not something that is easily accepted, especially at the level of company owners.
If processes are not studied before implementing a powerful information system like an ERP platform, it will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then you realize that adapting and implementing processes so they actually work in the system is much more expensive than just buying the system. And then you face a situation where you either propose another system if the current one is not working, or just keep some legacy solution on the balance sheet. That is also a question. And this destroys trust, and it is very hard to do because the level of possible error is very high.
The board depends heavily on external expertise and some market benchmark. Because board members have experience in different companies that may have gone through similar transformations, and they also have networks where there are people, companies, and organizations that can advise something. Someone has already faced ERP replacement, for example. Someone has already been in the same situation in their market and has done something about it. So you can always think through others, as they say, meaning consult someone, involve external experts, and the board always has a broader view than top management or the owner, simply due to experience and the number of members. That is why it is very important that these internal problems we want to solve through transformation are somehow based on external experience, unless we are doing it for the first time in the world, that our company is the only one doing it. We came up with this idea and we're doing it. That's also possible. This happens, but usually someone somewhere has already done something like this. Someone has already made their mistakes. Someone has already spent those $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 in several years, or had delays with such cases. So it is good to use the board to knock on someone's door and ask how it was, in your case, what mistakes you had. It may not save us from all mistakes, but it will help make the process smoother.
Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of business transformation turned out to be quite broad, deep, and very interesting and very important right now in Ukrainian business. Therefore, we will continue this conversation in the next episode. See you on the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel.